It is my great pleasure this evening to introduce Dr. Theodore Karamanski, an emeritus professor of public history at Loyola University Chicago and the author of 12 books and numerous articles about Indigenous, environmental, and Midwestern history. He has an extensive experience as a consultant to the National Park Service, USDA Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and the Cook County Forest Preserve District. He is a founder and operational board member of the Chicago Maritime Museum. Thank you. And his newest book is Great Lake, an Unnatural History of Lake Michigan, which I can attest is excellent. I will note that we are selling it in our gift shop, and you can get your copy signed this evening himself. Now, of course, this is Ted's most recent book. His book before that was Mastering the Inland Sea, How Lighthouses, Navigational Aids, and Harbors Transformed the Great Lakes in America, which was the first book I bought after getting an interview for this job. So thank you, Ted. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Karamanski.
What Madeline didn't say was I was one of the people doing the interview. So didn't have much choice. So let me just mention just a bit about how I came to write this book. Part of it goes back to like 1976. Some of you maybe weren't even born. But I had gone to the Auditorium Theater to see Gordon Lightfoot in a concert. And Lightfoot was kind of a crotchety guy sometimes. And as the concert was developing, he just kept playing the songs from his latest album. And every pause, somebody would shout out, you know, play If You Could Read My Mind, or play Early Morning Rain. And he would glower at it. And finally, after one of these, he said, just shut up for a minute. You people, you live right here on the shores of the Great Lakes. What do you think about them? What do you do about them? Do you pay any attention to the people who risk their lives helping the mines, mills, and factories work with their deliveries? Well, you should. And he started playing the Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And so it was like, whoa, okay. Here's a story I hadn't heard before because I hadn't. And as most people, this was a wreck that really, you know, had passed without much attention, and now it gets way too much attention. So that got me thinking about the Great Lakes. But even more profoundly, it's this place. It was the Chicago Maritime Museum that got me into this subject. And way back in 1980, there were a group of people who wanted to create a museum. And almost all of them are gone now, many of them even dead now. Dirk Lohm, who is forever young, is one of those early pioneers of the program. And I got involved just because some of our students were doing internships with the organization. And they would say every once in a while, oh, here's our maritime historian. I didn't know shit about the Great Lakes. I didn't know shit about ships. I was an historian, but I wasn't a maritime one. But being involved in this organization, which took us 35 years to get the museum, over those 35 years, you know, sooner or later, a few maritime things begin to seep in and subjects are studied. And so it's really a pleasure for me in the acknowledgements. It's really this museum that I owe the most to, with a little bit of acknowledgement to my sons, Ted and Joe, and my wife Eileen, who've shared so many times on the Great Lakes with me. Without further ado. So Lake Michigan basic facts. Perhaps the most significant one is 1.3 quadrillion gallons of water. This is now the most precious resource in the world. All around the world, there's a recent study that was put out by the United Nations that showed most of the freshwater sources are significantly compromised by pollution. And so this is something that definitely needs to be husbanded. You know, if you step out on your driveway in Denver and you look up, you can see the Rocky Mountains every morning. Well, when it's not too cloudy. It may take you 2 hours to get into the mountains, but you can see them right there. So they were ever present in your imagination. Not so Lake Michigan. I grew up in Chicago, and many people in my neighborhood never saw the lake. And the only way we saw the lake was because my dad would take us every few months to one of the museums down by the lakefront. And that's the glimpse we got of it. Otherwise, the water that is life to us, where does it come from? Oh, it comes from the city of Chicago. And the lake is not there. And it's crazy. You could actually be just 100 yards from Lake Michigan and not see it, not think about it. And this is the biggest problem the lake has right now, and even historically, but especially right now. If you don't know something, if you don't interact with something, you don't care about it. And this is the threat to those quadrillions of water. So these are some of the themes I'm going to touch on today. And it's kind of about 3/4 of the book represented there. But the first one is, I think, a very important one, and that is, this has always been a human landscape. The Rocky Mountains were around for millions and millions and millions of years before a single human footprint trod upon them. But that's not the case with the Great Lakes. Lake Michigan in particular begins simply as a meltwater pond for the retreating glaciers. And as that pond expands, people come into the region. The Paleo-Indian people are here when the lake is just beginning, when it's evolving. And so there's always a human interaction with the lake. And as you can see, over the centuries, over the thousands of years, the lake changes tremendously, both in terms of its outlet, but also its shape and size. Here's a Native American village. These would be what we would call today Paleo-Indian people, the first of the Native Americans to inhabit the North American continent. If you wanted to visit that village 7,000 years ago, you would have had to go about 70 miles from the current shore of the lake to visit that village. And while all these tremendously different changes, the lake's growing, the lake's shrinking, people are interacting with it. It is home to them. That village site is still there under the lake. There's ghost forests at the bottom of Lake Michigan from those Pleistocene era forests. So the remnants are there, but even more than the lake to someone who lived on the south side of Chicago, completely out of sight and something we don't even think about. Now, those native communities, which for thousands and thousands of years are interacting with this dynamic, changing landscape, have a very different relationship with nature than our modern scientific-based society. And it's what historians would call an ethical relationship with nature. Your interactions are bound by you respecting the power of every other thing in the world, not just even living things. A rock, a waterfall has a spirit to it. And that spirit can be appealed to, it can be reconciled with, it can turn against you. And so you have to have a strongly moral relationship with it. Now, it doesn't mean, if you ever see that, what was the Disney movie, Pocahontas? Colors of the Wind. The otter and the beaver are my friends. No, the otter and the beaver weren't their friends. Pocahontas was eating the otter and the beaver. But before she did so, she was careful to pursue certain rituals that demonstrated respect and maintained comedy with the spirit power of that creature. So the whole world was a web of spiritual relationships. That can be a problem, however. For thousands of years, all the time the lake's changing, it's not a problem. The native people, in part because of this ethical relationship, and in even larger part because their population numbers were relatively small, are not making a transformative impact on Lake Michigan. It's when invasive species come in. Now, we're used to thinking about this guy, right? The vampire of the lakes, the sea lamprey, as an invasive species. But settler colonial societies, such as ours, the Euro-Americans, are that as well. And a different value system comes into the lake in 1634 when Jean Nicolet arrives on the shores of Green Bay and attempts to bring the native people there into a trading relationship with the European continent through the fur trade. Now, Indians were very happy to be involved in this commerce. Getting metal tools, and that was nice. But more than anything else, what the fur trade relied upon was the exchange of cloth, wool, and cotton. And if you look at the natives in this picture, they're all wearing various types of European-made cloth. This coming at a time when those industries are going to be the basis for industrialization. So very important in developing Europe's economy, but very important for native people. And so they were happy to go to extreme exertions to get those items. And whoops, there we go. If you go ahead and think about what's happening there, this is a winter hunt. This is a beaver lodge. The beavers have 2 or 3 exits from their lodge underwater. Careful observation has taught these hunters where those exits were, and they blocked them. So now they're going to break into the top, and you can see they've already killed 2 beavers, and they're going to finish off whatever else is in there. Now, if you have an ecological understanding of nature, it might occur to you that, okay, we've killed the mom and the dad beaver, but we might be best to leave the children so that there will be beaver in future. But if instead you have this ethical relationship and you have followed the proper prescriptions, asking the beaver to forgive you for what you're doing, there's no need to limit your kill to simply the adults. As you begin to hunt beaver to extinction in the region, there is something very important that happens. This is the way the landscape of the Great Lakes region, the area around Lake Michigan, looked in an era when there were hundreds and hundreds and thousands, literally, of beaver dams all through the watershed. It spreads the water out broadly. It creates ponds. It feeds the underground water supply because water's sinking down. It enriches the forest soils, makes them more resilient to forest fires. And so, and most important of all is from the lake's point of view, this is all slowing the flow of water down, and water's bringing with it a certain amount of silt, but because it's going slow, sinking down into the ground, enriching the soil in the hinterland. On the other hand, you get over here, the beaver dams are gone, okay? And now the river is just flowing straight. It is not absorbing as much water into the landscape. Instead, the current's going quickly and it's bringing more soil into the lake. Now, there are lots of these beaver dams. This is just a small section of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, the Carp River Valley. And a naturalist comes along and he counted 64 beaver dams. So all of this is where we are. These are beaver dams, beaver dams, beaver dams. Over here, same thing, beaver dams. And so they're controlling the flow of water. When they're not there, there's going to be a lot more sediment coming into the lake. And so here we see the first of the impacts of Euro-Americans in the market. They're going ahead and putting in on the gravel spawning beds of Great Lakes fish. They're putting the silt, and that's inhibiting new fish from being fertilized and hatched. Over time, this is something that we keep making worse. So the fur trade comes, the fur trade goes. We have this problem, but it gets worse because the fur trade is replaced by the lumber industry. The lumber industry is going to be moving pine logs and cedar logs. They're going to be moving them on the water in order to get these, you can see, are some pretty big logs. They don't want to carry these. They want the river to carry them. So they want the river flowing fast. So they build a whole series of dams in the hinterland and then open them all up at once and have a torrent of water pushing the logs down the stream. All of these are rivers on which logging took place. All of those new rivers that have been dammed and channeled for the lumbermen are flushing more and more sediment into Lake Michigan, and thereby impacting the fishing even more so. Look what happens with those rivers. And of course, they're not just cutting down trees. Once they cut down the trees, they want to sell the land to farmers. And then the farmers are coming in and they're pursuing generally some monocultural crop, usually wheat initially, then corn. And when it rains, their fields, the furrows of the planter become rivulets to hurry the silt-laden water into Lake Michigan. So that was just the beginning. Then we have the flood that comes in the 19th century. And these are people with alien values. They didn't come to America just to survive. They came to do well. They came with a commercial purpose. And one of the things they wanted more than anything else was that which was denied them by the thugs who ran Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire, the warrior elite who became the dukes and the earls who controlled the land. And the peasants had no land. They came and they wanted land. And they sacrificed mightily to be able to get it. And land became the great commodity. Well before the United States had a constitution. The United States had something called the Land Ordinance of 1785 that's still in effect. If you bother to look at the property record for the house you live in, it is set up on the township and range system for locating any piece of land anywhere in America by a set of numbers, and you can accurately pick exactly where it is. So you can stay in New York City and be confident of the land you're buying in Illinois. Why did this government do this before they even had a constitution? Because selling the land was going to be their principal source of funding for the federal government. So it was just fundamental into the American system. They knew this is what the people wanted. They knew this is what the government had, and it was going to be a happy marriage that was going to keep us from running deficits back in the day. And this is, you could get a sense of how this is different than the ethical relationship that Native Americans had in this quote from Tecumseh. Tecumseh was a Shawnee war leader. He was the last Native American who really had a chance to put a halt to American expansion. And talking to a future president of the United States, he says, sell country? Why not sell the air, the great sea, as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children? A little socialistic, I suppose, but it reflected that different ethic. And as the market-driven approach became predominant, backed up by the bayonets of the United States Army, Native Americans were removed from the region. No Native American presence today in Ohio, Indiana, or Illinois, save, of course, ones who immigrated in the 1950s. Michigan and Wisconsin have their little islands of Native American. And it's a very exciting thing today that those communities that are on the shores of Lake Michigan are beginning to be more assertive and taking a role in the management of the resource. But they were generally pushed aside for a century and a half. So these people who came in and were determined to do well in America, getting the land was great, but getting the product of the land to market was essential. And so they involved themselves in a whole series of navigational improvements that continue to this very day. But the Erie Canal, opening in 1825, was the first one that brought invasive species from the oceans into Lake Erie. And eventually, those critters, like the lamprey, made their way into Lake Michigan's lake trout population. But the worst was the ill-conceived 1959 St. Lawrence Seaway. Too small to be really useful, better as a water power project for the people in New York City than it ever was for transportation improvements, but it was a highway, a super highway for invasive species. And to this day, the invasive species keep arriving in the ballast water of European vessels, and there is still not fully effective measures to ensure that doesn't happen. So this is where you ever hear of the zebra mussels, right? So those zebra mussels, they were terrible. You can see, look, in 1994 and 2000, they're spreading, 2005. Hey, 2010, hey, zebra mussels aren't a problem. If you walk along the shores of Lake Michigan today, oftentimes you'll come across huge piles of dead zebra mussels. They have been outcompeted by another invasive species, and this is now the dominant invasive species in Lake Michigan, replacing European Americans, and that is the quagga mussel. The quagga mussel just completely took over. And so today there's 480 trillion quagga mussels coating the bottom of Lake Michigan, completely transforming the ecosystem, turning it gradually into an aquatic desert as they go ahead and destroy the bottom of the food chain that all large fish need to survive. 480 trillion. There's only 3 trillion trees in the entire world. So somehow these guys have taken over, and all the terrible things, and I'll talk about some of them, that we've done to Lake Michigan, they have more power over it than we do. But we did do some things. Now, you meet people from around the country, and sometimes you say, where are you from? Well, Chicago. And they kind of look at you, especially if they're from Texas or Florida, maybe it's like, oh, how do you manage that? Well, we know that this is like a fantastic place to be, particularly in the summer and fall. The lakefront is just marvelous. We really live in one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And that's because of the engineering that we've done to the lakefront. And it is a considerable cause of mischief because it exasperates the problem of erosion. Erosion is a natural thing that happens along the shores of Lake Michigan. But once you start to transform the lakefront and put in obstacles, you disrupt. Normally, you'll lose a little bit of sand and then you'll gain some. Instead, people are just losing. Good example, Southworks United States Steel Corporation. They're making steel. When they're all done with the process, they got all these clinkers that are left over. It's a combination of limestone, coal, coke, and iron ore. And so they got all these, they throw them in the lake. And after a while, they say, hey, we're getting a bigger lakeshore. So they ended up putting in 500 acres of new shoreline. Here it is today. They're not polluting the lake anymore, but there's this huge chunk of land. And the normal flow of sand that would be coming down the shoreline is being caught, interrupted by this and so many other of these man-made obstructions into the lake. All along the Chicago lakefront, you're walking your dog, you see these things, right? Or even little, sometimes even larger piers going out into the lake. And capturing sand, sand lost on the other side. One of the worst examples of this was when Bethlehem Steel Corporation got the state of Indiana to approve the building of this Burns Harbor, right in the middle of what was supposed to be Indiana Dunes National Park. The Chicagoans had worked for generations to create. So instead, they built the steel plant right there, and it is another major problem, stopping the dunes from being replenished. This great natural feature we have. Even worse. So they had to dredge all this sand and that where the dunes had been. Northwestern University said, hey, can we buy that? And then they put in another landfill to the north that blocks even more natural deposition. So one guy protects his property, somebody else is going to pay the price because they are going to lose. And we've been doing this for hundreds of years now. So it's almost, and what's worse about these things is we have a legal right to be able to walk along the shoreline. And when somebody does this, no, you can't be at the natural high water mark anymore. You are denied access to that piece of lakefront. And then there's the crime of sand mining. I mean, huge dunes all along the lake have been taken down over the years. Initially, this was done, you remember Ball Jar Company, you know, where did they get the sand for their jars? And that was from Lake Michigan. Then the auto industry for making foundry molds, but then also for the glass. All that's Lake Michigan. And now fracking is another need for the sand. So you can, these are active sand mining operations on Lake Michigan today. So it doesn't end. It just keeps going on. Now, one of the issues that I touch on briefly is the social construction. Social construction means that, yeah, there's Lake Michigan there. It's a natural fact. But how do we regard it? Do we regard it as a precious natural resource? Or in the 19th century, Chicagoans insisted that Lake Michigan was an inland sea. It was a great waterway made for commerce. And they needed to have certain implements, infrastructure put in to use it for commerce. So here's a quote from a Frenchman who was almost killed on the Great Lakes in 1838. "I have seen the storms of the channel, those of the ocean, the squalls off the banks of Newfoundland, those of the coasts of America, and the hurricanes of the Gulf of Mexico. Nowhere have I witnessed the fury and elements that I found on this freshwater sea." And there's no natural harbors on the whole southern 3/4 of Lake Michigan. You got some up by Beaver Island and the Manitous. That's it. They had to make harbors, and they needed the government to do it. Well, the government made harbors for Charleston. The government made harbors all along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. So they had to get the government to agree that Lake Michigan was an inland sea and needed to be considered as such. So it was a huge fight between the Great Lakes states and the South. And one of the reasons that the Northwest region of our country was so strong in supporting the Union cause and produced people like Lincoln and Grant. Here's the Chicago River. This could be your harbor, right? You could send the ships up the river, but the flow of water is so weak from the Chicago River, and the waves are so strong from Lake Michigan, they just deposit sand there all the time. So yeah, you can float your canoe right over there, but don't try to take a 200-foot ship over that sandbar. So they had to come up with another one of these impediments. These were among the first on the lake that interrupted the flow of sand so that sand wouldn't clog the harbor. Chicago got the first harbor on Lake Michigan and one of the first on the Great Lakes, but at the cost of over $3 million. And so the government said, we don't want to do any more of these. It wasn't until after the Civil War that the government really got involved in supporting navigational infrastructure. They needed channel improvements. They needed charts. They needed harbors for sure. And so today, Lake Michigan is a much safer place to sail because we've got these 50 lighthouses, not to mention our navigational satellite navigation aids, 53 harbors of refuge along the lake. So all of this was transforming the lake to suit the commercial purpose that needed the lake to be an inland sea, a commercial waterway. Now, once you really get into your head, this is an inland sea, you think about the waters differently. And the ocean, after all, is huge. The ocean is immense. The seas are limitless. And so they treated them that way and dumped the pollution of their potties into the lake. Every town along the lake did this. Chicago did it a little bit more, but they all did it. And that led to a very unprecedented program of stealing Lake Michigan water. Nobody had thought of doing this before. And they did it, didn't ask anybody's permissions. They just said, let's go ahead and dig a canal so deep that it will force the water to run away from Lake Michigan. And as it does so, it'll suck thousands, millions of gallons of lake water into the river where all of Chicago's sewers emptied into, including those stockyards. And then we can go ahead and build water intake cribs a couple miles out. We'll get nice, clean, fresh water for everybody. So Chicago removes 3,200 cubic feet per second of water from Lake Michigan. Half of that goes to people's homes, and the other half is used to flush the waste downstream. Now, that waste doesn't just go straight in anymore. Back in the Depression, we got money from the federal government to build the settling ponds over there in Stickney and so forth. But this program still is very important to the city of Chicago, stealing water. Now we're selling it to Joliet. This was the latest. This is a big chunk of change that Chicago desperately needs. But we're taking water out of the great, Joliet's on the Mississippi Valley. We're taking it out of the basin, and only Chicago gets away with this. And one of the bigger expenditures of the federal government to go to any one city was the $11 billion deep tunnel project. And that was supposed to solve all our problems, because when we had bad storms, we were going to take the dirty water, it's going to sit in the tunnels and in some of the reservoirs until all the storms are over, and then we can gradually pump it into filtration and cleaning and put fairly clean water back down and give it to people in St. Louis. One of the difficulties, of course, we know deep tunnel hasn't worked out the way they said it did. And part of the reason is because they got all this wonderful limestone they dug out. And well, this is a valuable resource. We can sell it. It could be used to make cement. And they used the cement to pave over more of Chicago so that less water was being absorbed by the ground and was rushing into the sewers and, alas, sometimes into people's basements. So after all these interventions, here's what we've done to Lake Michigan today. We're not the worst of the lakes, but each thing we've done to the lake, either for commerce or residential or invasive species, all of these things have stressed the lake. And you can see in particular where those stress points are. And dealing with those is complicated by the fact that it's great. Lake Michigan's just all in the US of A, but it's split between 5 states. And these, excuse me, 4 states. And they each have their own issues. I talked about Chicago, we're just stealing the water. Okay. Indiana, it's a minuscule portion of the lake. They put out the most pollution into the lake. They have the worst environmental laws. Michigan, oh, they're the Great Lakes state. They love it. Yeah, but they're mining the sand 6 ways to Sunday, no stopping there. And back when they wanted to improve the sale of fishing licenses, they stocked Lake Michigan with coho salmon, and a totally exotic species, didn't ask anybody's permission. Well, Chicago gets the water, we'll get the fish. And then finally, our good friends in Wisconsin, the dairy state. Well, those dairy cows eat hay and corn, and that's grown by the farmers. And off those fields that are fertilized with phosphates, they flush that into the lake, creating algae blooms. But each state says, we got it, we'll take care of it. We used to have something called the EPA. And we need it again. So let me conclude with some quotes. And what's a lakeshore state of mind? We mostly interact with the lake when we do by standing on the shore. The shore is this liminal place where our imagination and the waters meet. And one of the people who I think really got this early on was Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan was the reason Chicago became such a great place for architecture. He began that process, but he came as a young man when they were still cleaning up the debris from the Chicago fire. But when he arrived, he was impressed by what he saw. He was impressed by the tremendous maritime activity. I saw a fleet of schooners and stream from the mouth of the river, spread their wings, and in a great beautiful flock gleaming in the sunlight as they moved in a favoring wind, fan-like toward Muskegon and other northern ports. This was the lake, was this opportunity for commerce, for exchange, for business. But the other faced the other way, and there was the great prairie, the short grass prairie that stretched all the way and beyond the Mississippi River. Writing in the third person, Louis Sullivan writes in his autobiography, he caught glimpses of a great lake, spreading like the floor to a far horizon, superbly beautiful in color under a lucent sky. Here was power, naked as the prairies, greater than the mountains. His eye was ever on the boundless prairie and the mighty lake. He saw, he intuited that the lake and its marvelous maritime traffic and the prairie, which by his time was being crisscrossed by trains bringing the harvest of the prairie to Chicago, that Chicago was essentially a threshold between two very diverse ecosystems. And so this was a very big part of his architecture. So when we think about his building, the manufacturer's building in the 1893 World's Fair, notable by its great arch. So many of his bank buildings all across the prairie, and again, with arches. The wonderful auditorium building where I heard about Gordon Lightfoot. Again, the arches. And perhaps most famous of all, the arch entering into the business people who really brought about that integration of lake and prairie, the Chicago Board of Trade. But alas, they tore down the whole Board of Trade building, and we only have his arch. Now, most of us aren't great architects or artists, but I think so many of us are attracted to the lake. And if you think about, in particular, the lakefront, how on a weekend it is thronged with people. It's in part because the densest populated areas in Chicago are right near the lake, but it's also, I think, because of the water. And Willa Cather, in her marvelous book, The Professor's House, touched on what she saw the lake could do for your psyche. But the great fact in life, the always possible escape from the dullness, was the lake. The sun rose out of it, the day began there. It was like an open door that nobody could shut. The land, in all its dreariness, could never close in on you. You only had to look at the lake, and you knew you would be free. Maybe some of you have felt that same sense of freedom looking at the lake. Carl Sandburg touched on this as well in his poem, The Harbor. Passing through the huddled and ugly walls, by the doorways where women haggard looked from their hunger deep eyes, haunted from the shadows of hunger hands. Out of the huddled and ugly walls, I came sudden at the city's edge on a blue burst of lake. Long waves breaking under the sun, on a spray-flung curve of shore, and a fluttering storm of gulls, masses of gray wings and flying white bellies, veering and wheeling, free and in the open. And then this one last quote from Ben Heck. Maybe you don't know him so well, but he was a prominent journalist in Chicago, very famous, but also went to Hollywood and was a great script writer there. And he has an essay in this book, 100,001 Afternoons in Chicago, called Lake Thoughts. The lake asks you an old question as you ride to work or come home from work on the icy train. Where are you going? Perhaps it's because the inanimate sweep of water and its hugeness and silence make one forget the petty things and greedy trifles from which form the routine of one's day. And when one forgets these things, one remembers, alas, something they pleasantly obscured by their presence, a dream perhaps long buried, a hope, an emotion successfully unturned under the amiable rubbish the days have piled up. Then too, there is the question, where are you going? And an answer to that seems to come out of the long reaches of water. Come with me. Somewhere, nowhere. Now, the lake can be beguiling, but it can be deadly still. With all the improvements, now they've deployed these life preservers. A couple of kids died last year in the lake, and now they put these life preservers on the piers. Good idea, because more people die in Lake Michigan than any of the other Great Lakes. When you go ahead and step from that warm sand into cold water, you are entering a wilderness. When you step off a dock into the heaving deck of a boat, you're entering Lake Michigan's cold embrace. And you best be on your guard, because it is still a wilderness waterway. It still has the ability to surprise us. It can take your life, or it can just mess up your morning commute. It was a pleasure to share this show with you today, and thanks so much for coming.
We do have some time for questions for Ted. I am going to ask Ted to rephrase the question when he answers them for our people watching at home. And thank you again.
Sure.
Fantastic.
So has anybody got in their hearts enough for more? Yes, sir.
The origin of the sand.
The origin of the sand. Wow, there's a question that I can't answer probably.
Fair enough.
It's the glaciers. The glaciers, one thing's the grinding of 2 mile thick of ice is it pulverizes.
Sure.
And that's one of the ways sand
So
comes.
it lies in the bottom and gets churned up and lifted.
And yeah, well, it gets lifted by the wind. So you have these sleeping bear dunes in Michigan.
Yeah.
It's created by the wind going across the lake. So the Wisconsin shore, they got a couple of decent beaches, but not
Money
many.
comes from the west, not from the east back to the west.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Okay, so the question was about the lake being frozen this year, somewhat more than the last 10 years, really, and Superior completely and Erie almost completely as well. So yeah, but that was just a welcome development that illustrates for us how much the lakes have changed. Because this used to be something that would happen once every 2 or 3 years. Now we're looking at like once in a decade. And this is shaping the lake. in ways that we don't fully anticipate right now. Certainly, there's going to be more evaporation when there's less ice. More evaporation means less water. On the other hand, global climate changes can bring torrential rainfalls that can bring more water, too much water. So we don't know exactly how this is going to all work out.
Because on the shore right now, the last 2 weeks, it's huge, actually.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I got some great pictures of that. Thank you for your question. I'm old enough. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it certainly was. We can compare horror stories. Okay.
In 2020 was probably the highest the lake level was at.
Mhm.
And that's when we saw the big ice caves,
Mhm.
right? Pictures of them up north. Since then, it's been slowly going down. It's gone about 32 to 40 inches down
Mhm.
from where it was then. And this year it's forecast to stay about stable.
Yeah, and there was a rallying point in between those years where all of a sudden people thought, oh, it's back, it's too high. And so historically, you're looking at trends of the lake rising or falling on a 20-year cycle or so, sometimes even longer. But now we're seeing this in a 3 or 4 year period of time. And that new level of instability is, again, a warning sign of significant change to the ecosystem.
One of the things I understand it has to do with other cities taking water from the lake and creating counterbalance to how much water, like Michigan, has been taking. In fact, when Saddle Harbor was formed, it occurred because supposedly the water was leaking from the lake into the river through the seawalls at that time. And that's when they rebuilt the seawalls and closed in Chicago Harbor, because that used to be an open turning basin and met right with the locks. And the conversation at the time, I don't know the credibility of it, was that St. Mary River was dug out, and that was causing water to come out of the lake.
The St. Clair Channel.
Yes, yeah.
So you're talking,
Maybe you can add to that.
well, they tried to make for the stupid seaway, they tried to make a deeper channel from the Detroit River to Lake St. Clair and Lake Huron. And they took out too much of the bottom, and then it created a huge flow that then gouged out more.
Right.
So that did significantly lower lake levels, but it's not from communities taking the water.
Fair enough.
But other questions? Bill, did you have a question? Okay.
Yes.
The case of the Illinois diversion is equivalent to Charles Dickens's Bleak House. In one of these cases that goes on, and nobody after a while can understand how it ever started and how it'll ever be resolved. Yeah, Aaron.
Fresh water, the gold, and is there any kind of collaboration between these, the Great States or even more on Lake Michigan to preserve, to address some of the many issues that you raised in the.
Yeah, that's a good question, Aaron, because as these changes have been cascading, the Great Lakes states and Canada have gotten together and created something called the Great Lakes Compact, which Congress has approved. And it prevents anyone from taking water out of the Great Lakes drainage system. So if you take water from the lake, you have to put it back in. basically except Chicago. Yeah, as everybody in Joliet now knows.
We lived something in Barrington,
Mhm.
and we still have, we had deep wells there now going to feed us from Lake Michigan.
Right, and this is why it's such a valuable resource.
Yeah.
All across the world, the aquifers have been drained and as well as being polluted.
Yeah.
And so this huge body of water is going to be of increasing significance. And it's the Great Lakes Compact, states all signed it, Canada signed it, Congress approved it. What we've seen from executive overreach in the last year, it could be destroyed, it could be ripped up. And if so-and-so wanted to do something, they could take that water and pipe it over to Nebraska. Yeah, maybe we'll do like one more question. I'm happy to stay here and talk, but people have got to get going too. Yes, ma'am.
What about line 5 and its threat to Michigan?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. People in Michigan are pretty certain they don't want line 5 to be rebuilt. This was a oil pipeline, was bringing oil from Canada across the Straits of Mackinac into lower Michigan. And from lower Michigan, it was coming down into Illinois, and from Illinois and Michigan, it was going back to Canada.
I mean, after being processed?
Yeah. It's just, Canadians didn't want to send the oil and pipelines over the Precambrian rock of the Canadian Shield.
So
And
they looped it up and around.
so they looped it through the US. So this is crucial for Canadians to get this oil into their country.
Yeah.
It's also plays an important role in, Midwestern economy as well. So the plan is to dig, right now, it's just this pipeline laying at the bottom of the lake. And ships toss their anchors down and it snares on there. It's just an accident waiting to happen. The company that manages this pipeline is completely irresponsible. They caused the biggest oil spill in the Great Lakes on the Kalamazoo River a few years ago. So these are bad people, but the plan is to dig this tunnel now underneath the lake and have the pipeline go through there so that if it leaked, it wouldn't go directly into the lake. And so right now, it's up to the governor of Michigan to see if she is going to stick with her plans against it. But that's a complex issue. I'm sorry.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm interested to see, do we have any questions online?
There is one, we got to unmute. Tell Sam to unmute and ask a question.
Or he can type it in the chat or
He has his hand up.
Okay.
you can tell Sam, you can unmute, ask your question if you can. Otherwise, we'll have him put it in the chat and we can get to it after. Okay. My internal clock is ticking on our online question.
This is just like radio shows, when they have the call in person. It never works.
You are fifth caller. Okay,
So,
you got preload losing tickets.
so,
Let's see.
so this young lady has a question while we're waiting.
Speculate what's going to be cut in the federal budget? I mean,
Everything.
resources are concerned.
Sure. Well, we know one thing that has been approved by Congress, but is currently being held up by the executive branch. And that is the funding to complete the barrier at the Brandon Lock and Dam to prevent Asian carp from getting into Lake Michigan. So that's one problem there. But the biggest difficulty in funding is the gradual rescission of funding for science. So many of all across the Great Lakes, the universities, private organizations, I have research programs that are being decimated by the lack of federal partnership.
Okay, well, I know there are a lot of questions in the room, and that's why we're so lucky that Dr. Karamanski is going to hang around a little bit to answer them. But another round of applause for
Thank you.
Do you have your